Welcome to the Better Two podcast. I'm your host, Donna. Today's guest is Robert Schreiner. Robert has a book out called The Wolves and the Greyhounds, and it talks about World War One and a very small battle that most people don't know about. So check it out. Hi, Robert. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Donna. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So you have a colorful background, and you started off on your writing journey because of one of your children's projects, a history project. Isn't
That's
it
right.
interesting how some things lead to another thing? So tell us a little bit about how this all came about with your book.
Sure. That when all of our kids we have three children, and they're all about a year apart in age, and they're a year apart in school. And so each of them had the same history teacher for their freshman year of high school. And in that history class, the teacher focused on the First World War and wanted, they had an assignment that varied slightly from year to year, but the general assignment was that each of the students had to uh, essentially write a journal as if they were a participant in the First World War, and they could be a soldier, they could be a nurse, they could be someone who flew a plane or drove a boat or whatever it was. They could sort of decide what they really wanted to do, but they had to write this journal, and so they had to do all the research to be able to put together something that sounded realistic. And then, of course, they got to do fun things like make it look aged, like it was 100 years old, and bind it in leather and things like that. So we got to help our kids, sort of, with this project as you would do.
Mhm.
And one of the it's kind of a rare circumstance where our kids, nerdy dad with all of his military history books was actually useful for something other than driving them to a school function. So all of a sudden, I had all these books that might actually be useful. So I was giving the kids these resources, and as part of that, I would look at some of the books to see how, if they were appropriate, if it was something they could use. And in that process, I came across a passage about the Battle of Coronel in the First World War. And even though I'm a military history buff and I've read all kinds of things about, all kinds of battles and wars and all kinds of things, I didn't know really anything about the Battle of Coronel. And it was intriguing, and the backstory was a little intriguing. And so I let the kids do their thing, but that stuck in my head. And so I looked at this battle some more and did some more research. And by the time the third child had done their project, I was really hooked about this story, and I had actually ordered some additional resources. I bought some old out of print books online. I had actually gone, I'd really, talking about nerding out, I had really done that with respect to this particular event in history. And I became convinced that this real story was an extraordinary inspiration for a fictional book. I thought I could really write a story about these events and you know talk about it in a way that you wouldn't be able to in a nonfiction account, where you could really get into the heads of the characters and what they were doing and their motivations and all of that. And so that really was the inspiration for it, was those history projects from our high school age kids.
Well, and the funny thing is, you were talking about the fact that you had these books and you had, I don't know about you, but sometimes, yes, I amass books on subjects that I'm interested in that I never get to read. They're just there collecting dust. And it's like, oh, wait, I can go look at that. So it sounds like maybe that started, you were forced to look at books that maybe you hadn't totally visited or maybe you hadn't revisited in a while.
That's right. Now, there were definitely books that had been collecting dust for, a decade or two, that turned out to be useful not only for the kids, but for myself in my initial research. And then I ended up, as I said, I filled up almost a whole bookshelf worth of books as part of my research subsequently.
The one shelf you cannot see that's behind me, because I write books that are set in the 80s and the 90s. And while the internet is a wonderful tool, and since you're writing something historic, you can find some information, but you can only go so far back. And like for me, certain places do not exist if they're not around in the 90s or 2000s. The internet doesn't even recognize that they were in existence. So I go buy old travel tour books, and yeah, I have books from 1985 and 82, and it's like, well, this is for my research. So I understand.
Absolutely.
And yes, people can look at you like, why are you buying that? But, one man's trash is another man's treasure.
Yeah, and as the research process itself was, it really then, when I really got serious about the research, it took about 3 years just of research before I even wrote the first word of the book. And as part of that process, I reached out, and there's where the internet was useful. I reached out to resources all over the world, and I was really humbled and impressed by the responses that I got from people who were really excited that I was working on this project, people who were historians themselves. I reached out to the Royal Naval College and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and places where some of these resources, some of these old books or journals or ship's logs or rosters of
Wow.
ship's crew had been sitting around, talking about collecting dust for nearly a century. And in some cases, nobody had requested this information. And the fact that they had it and that I was interested in it, I got such great assistance and support from people from, again, all over the world. I was able to get, articles written from German newspapers and things from Australian newspapers.
Wow.
It was a really extraordinary thing from these archives. And again, the help that I got from these people all over the world was really impressive and again humbling. And so, uh, and as it turned out, all those books that I had, accumulated, those were, written by historians themselves, many of whom, some of them had been in the Royal Navy, some of them had, were just, archivists, whatever it had been. And one of the really interesting things that I came across was that, and this wouldn't necessarily be a surprise, but as different people recounted the same event, those accounts were all a little bit different. And so the same event, as viewed by different people at the same time, maybe they were on a different ship or they were a participant in a different way, their account of it was, in some cases, subtly different, some cases substantially different. And that part of it really solidified for me my desire to be able to tell this story from different perspectives. And so consequently, the book is actually told in sort of alternating chapters from the German perspective and the British perspective, the German perspective and the British perspective. And their take on it, as recounted in these historical resources, is in some cases very, very different. And again, not surprising, but it was really a fascinating part of the process.
Well, in a romance world, we would call that a duet because you have the two POVs. And
Right.
I always find it very fascinating that when you can do that because you get a fuller picture there. You get a full background of, okay, I'm not just telling you the British version, I'm giving you also this. And so therefore, it's a more broad scoped, dynamic picture for the reader. And that can translate, whether it's an audiobook or a film, into a much bigger scope of things.
And that was my intent. I really wanted to tell this story from as full a perspective as possible. Unlike a lot of uh, military thrillers or in books that might be comparable, there really isn't a bad guy in this story. I mean, there are folks who do things that could be, considered villainous. There are folks who do things that would be considered cruel or perhaps dishonorable, and that's as close to villainy as it gets, really, I think. I really tried to convey the story as accurately as possible, uh, um, but that part of it is being able to tell that story as fully as I could really became an important part of the process for me. Yeah, because as it turns out, it didn't really matter who had the advantage at a given period of time, who was likely to win a given battle. Both sides were terrified. Both sides were, fearing for their lives and missing their families and far from home and, cut off from communication. And there were so many parallels, regardless of which side the combatants were on. And I wanted to be able to convey that human element to it. They weren't just, and again, it's a work of fiction, but I did try to hew to the actual historical timeline as closely as possible.
But I think you make a valid point with that because when you look at war, we don't think about the human element of it. We think about, okay, they did this to us. We're going to go over there and we're going to do this. And this is somebody that's never going to see the battlefield that is now commanding you to go do this. And so we don't look at the person that is maybe they're proud to be fighting for their country. I'm not saying that that wouldn't be the case, but we take out the human element of they're fearing for their life. They are doing their job. They're missing their family. They are dealing with possibly watching somebody die in front of them. Multiple people die. They with the possibility of having to kill somebody. We don't look at all those elements. We just think, oh, we're going to go take over this place or we're going to go fight for this. But what about the human element in it? And so what you're saying is you brought that in there, and that's an amazing story because most of the time when you watch a war movie, they touch on that slightly, but you don't have the full picture.
Right. And I really wanted to convey that as much as I could. I mean, yeah, and this was, it was a different era in terms of technology at the time. And, now I think, tend to take for granted our global connectivity and the amazing technological means that we have to communicate. But back in 1914, voice-to-voice radio didn't yet exist.
Mm.
There were radio communications between ships and ships to shore and vice versa, but it was all encoded. Think kind of the Morse code type of thing. These were encoded signals that had to be decoded into something that could be read and interpreted and then sent back again. Very cumbersome process. Certainly not something that was easy to do in real time, especially in a dynamic combat environment. And there certainly wasn't the ability to talk to somebody back home. And if one of the things that is a common theme in the book and it's a theme in the book because I encountered it so often in the research was the idea of writing letters home and getting letters back and just encountering a newspaper occasionally. And so we now have really abandoned the idea of writing letters to people. We can rip off an email or a text and reach somebody across the world, but really not that long ago, writing a letter was the best way to reach someone who lived in a farther than the town next door kind of a thing. So, and certainly in 1914, when folks who are assigned to a combat vessel, whether they were German or British, would write letters home, and they would generally stack them up. And when they got to a port of call, they would those letters would be bundled from all the crewmen and they would be sent ashore to the local consulate to be sent home. And of course, those bundles of letters would then be put on a ship, and that ship would take, maybe a month or two to get to where it was going. And then their loved ones would get a stack of letters from whoever, their husband who was assigned to the ship far, far away. And a lot would transpire between the time that those
Yeah.
letters were sent to the time they were received. And and what would often happen on the other way is that their families would write them letters, not knowing anywhere they would be. And so those letters would be bundled and sent to a particular port of call with the expectation that a ship might arrive. But if the ship didn't get to that port of call, then they might be sent again to some other place in the anticipation that it was, again, very cumbersome. And so the rare circumstances where sailors would actually get letters from their loved ones was an extraordinary event, and where they could actually see newspapers written in their language and hear what was going on, especially during wartime, where they weren't getting real time notifications of what was happening. And the events of this book took place in the South Atlantic and the South Pacific, and very, very far away from the war in Europe. And so hearing about what was happening in Europe was a big deal, and they didn't get the chance to do that very often.
No. And I mean, you're right. It wasn't that long ago because I moved across the state when I was in the 1980s. And I had friends down in New Orleans and I moved up to Shreveport and I couldn't call them. My mom, I mean, long distance back then, there was no way I was going to be able to call. So yeah, I had to write her a letter. I had to write my friends letters. And it was the way you communicated because long distance at the time wasn't cheap.
Oh no.
So, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like it wasn't that long ago. Although now it's like 50 years, it's 40 years since the 80s, something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening to hear it said like that, but yes, you're right. No, in fact, speaking of the 80s, I was in high school in the 80s, and uh, I the first high school that I went to, I was a foreign service brat, so I grew up overseas, and I went to my first 2 years of high school. I was in Bangkok, Thailand, and made a lot of friends there. And then my dad was reassigned back to the States, and I stayed in touch with my friends in Thailand, and the only real way to do that was by letter. And
Hmm.
what's funny is that some of those letters that, they're still around. And, either my friends have them or I have them. And to see these like 12-page letters that, you bundle in, of course, even international postage was expensive
Oh,
back
yeah.
then.
Yeah, I had international pen pals.
So you have this big, thick stack of, folded letters that, are going to cost you, a couple, $3 just to mail it to somebody and across the world. And that was, definitely a different world and than what we enjoy today and really do
Oh,
take
yeah.
for granted now.
Well, I had one British pen pal that actually sent me a cassette. So it was like that was the closest to high tech as you could get. It was an audio letter. So, but you had to have the cassette player to put that in there and listen to the letter. But yeah, I mean, now everything's so instantaneous where back then it's like you want to go by somebody's house. Well, hopefully they were there. If they didn't answer the phone, you drive by, maybe they're there, but otherwise, you're SOL. You're not going to find them. And I
That's
think that's something that we've kind of lost with the fact that we have technology because everything is so instantaneous now.
oh
Even
yeah,
we
and
go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that I found to be a very powerful theme in this story where, that sense of isolation and detachment from home, from loved ones, and even from, in this particular case, the command structure. So you're being, the commanders, whether they're at the Admiralty in London or at the Admiralstab in Berlin, whether they are, they're sending those orders out, but how long does it take to get those orders out to the field? What has happened by the time those orders are received, and in many cases, the circumstances, the operational circumstances, the tactical circumstances had changed enough that those orders were really obsolete before they ever arrived. And when thousands of people's lives are hanging in the balance because of the way those orders are going to be interpreted, that mattered a lot. And and in this particular case, it really affected the course of the events that took place.
Do you think that your job, you worked for the CIA at one point. Do you think your job actually helped you with your research, helped you be able to dig into stuff more? I mean, I worked as an insurance adjuster, and one of my favorite parts of my job was the research I had to do in accident investigation. So I don't know that that's what you did in the CIA, but was that part of your ability to dig in and really research? Because I know a lot of writers that were just like, well, I didn't do that research. I just figured it was this way. There are other writers that are hardcore like you and me, but some writers are just like, whatever. Nobody's going to go back and look. But there's one reader that's going to come back and say, that's wrong.
Well, and I thought about that actually quite a bit. That the folks that are out there who are really into this, the handful of other people in the world who might be really into this subject, and I did want to get all those details right. And to the point where, I mean, in this book, I perhaps went a bit overboard. I mean, if for example, the officers standing on the bridge of the ship, or they see the moon, the phase of the moon on that day and that date is absolutely correct. And I went to that kind of level of detail. But to get back to your original question, yes, I would say yes. I mean, the work that I did at the agency, there was a lot of military analysis involved, and getting those kind of details right and making sure that you have checked your sources, and it's validating sources is a big deal in the intelligence world. Again, because people's lives are at stake, because there are very heavy duty, things that are at play in the geopolitical world and the military world. And so making sure that those details are right was a big part of it. And being able to structure my research in such a way that I could collate it and turn it into something that wasn't just a pile of data that actually would reflect in a story that had, a human element and nuance and emotion and had some compelling interest to a reader. And so I think it was instrumental actually in putting this together.
So when you were younger, we'll go back to the high school thing. I understand you're military brat. Was it your desire to join the CIA? Was it like, I'm going to be a CIA agent?
I thought about it. I mean, again, so I certainly had considered it as a child, and I played around. I considered going into the military. I considered going into the intelligence world, and I actually my first job at the agency was as an intern when I was in college, and so I did a collegiate intern program for 4 years, and uh, that was a really great way for me to kind of put my toe into that world. And then, when I graduated, I definitely was interested in that, so I became an intelligence officer right out of college.
Did you ever think you were going to write a book?
I've always been interested in writing, yes. And in fact, I had a few sort of attempts that didn't quite make it all the way. I've written lots of short stories and articles and something that you could possibly classify as a novella. So I had certainly worked on things like that, and nothing quite to the grand scale of this book, but I had always wanted to, and this was uh, that sort of light bulb moment where, hey, this is it. This is going to be the first real book, and so I had always wanted to do that for sure.
I kind of think with the fact that, I mean, granted, yes, they all had the same teacher, but I think that it was being sometimes, I guess, when I look at life, sometimes things are consistently presented to us over and over and over again. And we're like, nah, I don't, no, I'm not, no, it's not. And yet, finally, it's like after the light bulb moment, you go, oh, okay, maybe I'm supposed to be doing this. Did that ever occur to you that the first time when you sat down with your teen, oh, maybe I should be, this is interesting, but I mean, was it that moment or did it take the repetitive nature of this to really go, there's a story here?
It was a fair amount of repetitive, kind of recurring, coming back to this story because it definitely caught my attention. Partly, I mean, as I said initially, because I was surprisingly unaware of this battle and because I knew a fair amount about the First World War, but when people think about the First World War, they don't really think about naval combat. It isn't like the Second World War where people are very well aware of things that were related to naval combat, Pearl Harbor and Midway and Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and the U-boat attacks on Atlantic shipping, and that was a massive part of the Second World War. But in the First World War, not so much. And so most of the stories that have been told, either in books or movies, television shows about the First World War focus on either the Eastern or the Western Front and the grind that was the infantry action and the artillery and all that stuff. So I knew quite a bit about that, but I really didn't know much about the First World War naval action. So when it really kind of gnawed at me that this was such an interesting story, that how did I not know about this really interesting story? And when I kept coming back around to it, and so the more read about it, the more I became pulled in, and the more I reached out and tried to learn more about it, and then I was hooked. At that point, it's okay, I need to know as much about this as possible. And that was the next thing. If I'm going to write a book about something, the adage that you should write what you know. Well, I was not a First World War naval officer. And so if I'm going to write what I know, I really need to know this. I need to become an expert in this subject. And that was the next step, is that's why it took me several years to really dig into the data, understand it as fully as possible, everything from the technology at the time to the politics of the time to the uniforms that people wore to I mean, even the vernacular and some of the speech that people would use. I really tried to understand it as much as I could so that I could be as fluent as possible when then telling this story.
That's the thing. That adage of write what you know. My first book is written about it's written from the perspective of a guy who's having a midlife crisis, who's a rock star, who is a drug addict and a sex addict and all this other stuff. Do I know anything about any of that as far as personal experience? No, because I'm not a guy. So, but I've written it and people have been like, well, it sounds just like a guy who was going through all that. Okay, then I did my job. So I think that adage sometimes it gets in our way because, you know, you're supposed to know these things. Okay, as long as you've done your research, great. And yes, I've known some people that would fit that bill, so I could take their story. But the rule of acting is you have to live in the moment. So if you've done your research, you're capable of living in that moment of that person. You're capable of putting yourself in that moment of, I am away from my family. I am in the middle of this place. What am I going to do? So in a way, writing and acting very much can go hand in hand if you allow yourself to step into that moment and really
Oh, I
feel.
agree. I agree completely. I mean, Tolkien was not an elf,
No.
right? I mean, and so, yes, you absolutely can. I wanted to make sure, though, that I could be as authentic as possible when in writing this, and even that, there are definitely stretches that you have to make as a writer, as an author, as an artist, where you you have to assume what would a person in this circumstance do if you don't otherwise know what they would do, literally. And so you have to make that assumption. And then you also have to consider the narrative arc of the story. It has to be compelling. It has to, you're building to a climax. You're building, tension. You're, trying to build, take the reader along with you on this journey. And all of those things really demand a certain artistic license with what's going on, so that you can, again, build that tension or create this conflict or whatever it might be that otherwise might just remain static on the page, and you don't want that to happen.
No. So what did your kids say about you writing this book?
They were, what was funny is that they knew I was researching it, and they had seen, the evidence of it, and there were times where this book was in like giant binders of actual printed pages, and those were sitting around, and they had actually seen bits and pieces of it over the couple of years. And then it sort of went, I think for them, it sort of went dark and went silent. I was finishing it and revising it, and then, querying agents and doing all kinds of things that have nothing to do with, writing a book. Um, and when I finally published it, I think they were all like, well, really? Wow. It's happening. They kind of came back around again, and they were all pretty excited. And so they all have since read it anew, and I think they all were pretty amused that their high school project years ago was this, catalyst for this book.
Well, it's a pretty cool state. I mean, a pretty cool thing when they can look back and say, "Yeah, I helped Dad write that book. It's
Exactly.
because of me." And I mean, I'm sure there's a pecking order there because, well, I was first and I was, but I digress. So, what else? I had read that you like to cook. Is this correct? That you liked cooking?
I do, yes. Both my wife and I, we like to cook, and so occasionally there are kitchen duels. And so yes, we do like to cook, and uh, pretty much cover the whole range of cuisine. So sometimes there might be something Spanish going on. Sometimes there might be something uh, Vietnamese going on in the kitchen. You never know. There's all kinds of options there. So yeah, we really enjoy that.
So, being a military brat, where all did you live?
Our my dad's, and he was actually technically a foreign service brat. So my
Oh,
dad was assigned to the embassies, and he also worked in the intelligence world and in fact, my parents had met there. That's where they both met. They were both in the intelligence field. But the first of the assignments was in Vienna, Austria, and I was very young at the time. I was only a few years old, but I went to an Austrian kindergarten, learned German, spoke German. And then back in the States, then we went to England for well, 3.5, almost 4 years. And so I was a proper British schoolboy for those several years then. And then the last assignment was again in Thailand when I was in high school. And then after that, I came back, finished high school, went off to college, and then I was no longer traveling with my parents. But so it was a fascinating childhood. So I got the my love of military history really was born from, my traipsing around castles in, England and Germany and Spain and Italy and places as a little kid, and just, imagining myself in, the people's shoes who would have lived or fought or died there thousands of years before. So that was really the kind of what put the military history bug into me as, a young child.
Well, and you were talking about learning German. So for you, when you were doing the research, it was very easy for you to get some documents possibly from Germany or of the archives and understand them.
It was. I mean, it was certainly helpful. I mean, my German is admittedly rusty. I did take it again in high school and in college to keep up on it, but it was definitely helpful to not have to get translated versions of things that just weren't translated. German newspapers at the time, or again rosters of folks who were on the ship, some books and articles written by Germans at the time. And so, yeah, it was nice to be able to read that in its native form. Now, admittedly, technical German and conversational German are a little different. I mean, there are, German is a sort of a difficult language in that sense because there are very specific words. Technically in German for specific things, especially when you're talking about naval terminology and things like that. And so I definitely had to do some more research and kind of get some linguistic help with some of that stuff, but it was helpful.
Yeah, but even in New Orleans, there's certain words that are not used outside of New Orleans in the state. Like median. Most places in the United States say it's a median. I grew up with the word neutral ground.
Neutral ground.
Neutral ground, yes. That thing in the middle of the road is a neutral ground.
So
So,
somebody has to mow the neutral ground.
yes, yes. And so when you're talking about these things, people look at you like, what? Yeah, there was, and also my grandfather worked on the railroad at one point, my great grandfather, and my grandfather did too. So, a grip was a suitcase. And, it's not, but yeah. So even in America, we still have that, let's have conversational. And then also in New Orleans, south of New Orleans, you have the Cajun French, which is a whole nother dialect in itself
Right.
that I'm not even going to go into because I don't really know it. But yeah, good luck figuring that one out. So I think that's one thing we don't really think about, that there's so many different dialects here in this country that even though English is English, it doesn't always
Oh,
flow so well.
all right. Especially conversational English. That's definitely it's the broad range of things that
And especially as you get older and the younger generations come up with different words or different meanings for words that you used to use. And yeah,
Oh
get a
yeah,
little,
and now that our kids are much older, we no longer are plugged into all of that slang, and so all since we don't hear it, we'll have to wait for the grandkids to kind of re-educate us on what the latest slang words are for whatever is going on.
good luck with that. There's those moments where you start going, yeah, now I understand why my mom and my dad were just like, what are you saying? What are you doing?
Yeah,
I get it now. Um, so what are your plans? Are you writing a follow-up to this, or are you going to write another book? I mean, I understand that this was one event that happened, but has this given you the opportunity to say, since I did this, I can research another battle that maybe wasn't noticed, or another situation, or take what I've learned and create a spy book? I mean, do you have any plans to continue writing?
I do. And so the events that are chronicled, as you say, in the Wolves and the Greyhounds, there were several battles that occurred, you know, at that period of time, sort of mid to late 1914. There is another book that's sort of a sister story to this that I have outlined and may become a book at some point. And I also have another book in work that is a more modern thriller that has echoes of military history. And so I'm working on both things sort of simultaneously. Partly it's a matter of how how much interest is there in World War I naval action, that kind of thing,
Mhm.
even as a fictional book, versus something that might be a bit more modern. So I've gotten a number of ideas in my head now. They're all just kind of bursting, trying to get out, and I need to channel that energy in something that's productive. So yeah, I've got a couple things in work, and I enjoy writing so much. It's such a fulfilling process, and it's a fascinating thing and something that, I'm sure that you as a writer can understand this, but a lot of people who haven't actually written a book, especially a fiction book, wouldn't really understand. And it sounds absurd on its face, is that as a writer, a lot of times the story surprises you as the author and where it's going to go and what's happening as much as it might the reader. And that for me was one of the most fascinating revelations, was the fact that this story is going to go in a direction, even in this particular case, where the whole thing is framed around historical events. And so there's definitely a structure that it has to fit into. But even within that, there were places where I had no idea this book was going to go. And as I was writing it, that was happening. That was so much fun to be able to have the story take me, the author, in a place where I wasn't expecting it to be. And again, that I think to someone who hasn't written a book, that might sound absurd, but it truly is, it's a real thing.
Oh, it does not sound absurd. When I was working on the first book, I uh I was driving my husband to dialysis, and the main character of the book says to me, I got a better ending for you. I'm like, no, this is what this is going to be. He's like, no, I got a better ending for you. I'm like, fine. So I went ahead and I know people are like, she's hearing voices. No, characters do that. They give you ideas. And so I ended up, he's like, if you take my idea, you'll have more than one book. I'm like, fine. So I rewrote the ending and it was like, yeah, okay, I see where you're going. So I totally understand because at the time, yeah, I had this is the way it's going to end. This is it. I have the alternate ending somewhere on my computer, but yeah, it was just like, no, you need to do it this way. And
Right.
so no matter, I was going to ask you your opinion or a plotter. I plot things, but I will tell you that they will run amok and we're going this way. We're not going where you want it to go. And I think there's a genuine experience in that because you're allowing your creativity to flow. You're not putting these roadblocks up that say you have to write this. And the problem when you start sticking so much to the roadblocks is writer's block. You can't go any further. And sometimes even if a scene is presented to you that you feel wholeheartedly is okay, and something else, they give you something else. As long as you write that out and get it out on paper, it allows that to go away and you can go back to your original thing. But sometimes you just have to get the other stuff out. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to focus back on what you need to focus, if that
I
makes
agree. I agree. And there are times where that writing takes on a momentum of its own. And if you're on a roll, stay on the roll. And and it may not conform to what you had originally plotted out. And I'm definitely a plotter, and I'm definitely someone who's, created this structure. But there were plenty of times where something, was very clearly a creative, you know, dam break that created this sort of extraordinary flow of creativity and ideas, and it was worth going down that path. Now, going back and editing and rewriting, there may be some of that might be, okay, I went a little too far with this, and there are certainly times where I looked at this story and said, okay, I'm not telling the time, I'm showing how the watch works. And I really need to kind of bring that down a little bit. And, but at the time that you're writing, I think it's definitely worth going with that flow and seeing where that story takes you. And as a writer, that was always a really pleasant surprise to be swept away by my own story.
Oh yeah. I mean, I went 2 months without writing and then I started working on character Bibles, which is back to the research thing. And suddenly one of these characters that was a minor character in my second book is like, I want to tell a story this way. And I'm like, you're not supposed to be, you were just this little minor character. You don't have a voice. I let him play and I wrote 82,000 words, you know? So that's basically a novel. Will that novel ever see the light of day? No. but it got me writing. And
Yeah.
I will take some of the ideas from it, but that's the thing. Sometimes I just let it out because otherwise they're going to keep interfering,
Yep. I agree.
which sounds crazy, I know, but to writers, it normally isn't. So, what else do you like to do for fun besides write and cook?
I like woodworking, so whether it's building furniture or remodeling things, building out a workshop in the barn on our property, which is
Nice.
fun. So definitely like to do that. As you mentioned before, we like to cook, we like to travel. So all those things are keep me interested in the world, and that's it's always a lot of fun.
If you could go on a dream vacation, what would it be?
That'd be I'd actually probably be a long list. There's so many places. Even though I've traveled a lot of the world, there's so many places I haven't been, and so it's a pretty long list. That the for example, one of those daughters who was in high school and who helped, as the catalyst for this book, just got married this past year, and we went to India for her wedding, and so
Wow.
that was a one of those bucket list things. Going to India, we hadn't been, but there's a lot of places in the world that I would love to travel to, and places I'd like to go back to also. I mean, there are places that I visited as a child that I probably couldn't appreciate quite the same way that I would appreciate them now. And it would be fun to go back to Carcassonne or Stonehenge or some of these places that I saw when I was a child. So,
I had a guest recently that had written a book about her father's experience in World War II. And she went back to Serbia, where her father was from.
mm,
And he still remember, and he's like in his 80s now. And he remembered where he was when he was a 7-year-old boy. He could still walk those streets and still know things and know places because a lot hadn't really changed. So it was an interesting interview. And I think if you go back to those places, yeah, you have the perspective. What's amazing is because when I'm from New Orleans, but I went back after Katrina and I hadn't really been to my old neighborhood in forever. And so I went down there and it was just kind of like everything seems so much smaller now.
yeah.
So I'm sure if you went to Stonehenge, even though it's huge, I'm still, from the child's perspective to the adult perspective, I'd be like, well, this isn't any big deal. I mean,
I know, and then the fact, and there is actually a road that runs right by Stonehenge that, as a child, wouldn't have bothered me. As an adult, I'd probably be like, "Why is that road so close to this amazing, wonder of the world?" So,
it is kind of questionable. Why is it?
right,
It
right.
looks like just somebody could come in and create chaos. So is there anything that we did not talk about that you would like to add?
Well, I really appreciate the chat. This has been fun. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and talk about the book, and it's been a lot of fun.
Okay, thanks for coming on. Sometimes when we wrap recordings, we end up having a conversation afterwards, and we should have taped this part, but I thought we were done, and so did he. And so I pulled out this book that actually was my father-in-law's, and it's from World War II when he was in the Navy. And so we started talking about history and it talked about the fact that sometimes you take and you weave things in. You weave little bits of people that you know, stories, mementos, family things, and weave that into your story. And that, of course, brought up the whole fact that, me with my little nitpicky about my Volkswagen convertible story with the editor. But I think it's important that we try to bring reality, even though it goes back to write what you know. Sometimes we pull from other people's stories. We know somebody went through a tragedy, and it's not that you're co opting their story, but you know what they went through. You knew their emotions, you knew their feelings. Like this book. Granted, it's it's not in pristine condition. It's kind of the binding's bent and everything, but it has survived. And I mean, this is from 1954. So it has survived all this time. And I remember when we were cleaning out my late husband's parents' house after they passed, and somebody saying, "Oh, there's nothing of value in this house." Well, 10 to 1, this book would have got trash. But I've kept it and I will incorporate it as one of my characters' grandfather's books. So I think it's important that when you find a piece of history that we just don't discard it because learning if you discard history, then you're not learning everything you need to learn. History's important. There are lessons there. And sometimes, like Robert wrote, he wrote it from both the English and the German perspective. So you're getting a very dynamic picture because the one thing we don't think about is people are sent to war. They're sent to fight these battles. They're sent to fight these battles for people that will never leave or see these battlegrounds. And it's all because it's a cause. But there's a human element here. And war ultimately affects everybody. And when you think about the fact that when some of these people come back after not seeing their spouse or kids for that long, things have changed, especially today. So can you imagine not being able to hear from your person? Or, and that was something I didn't even bring up, but can you imagine, you know, getting a letter from your person after they're gone? That maybe somehow between the time that that letter was mailed and the time you get it, that you've got notified that they passed away. I mean, the horror, the shock. Granted, you still have their last words, but can you imagine the feeling? But his book sounds very fascinating. I used to love history, and I think history is an important thing that we all need to focus on and be aware of. Because if we don't, if we think things aren't real and this is manufactured and we don't pay attention to the truth of what we've done in the past, then we're destined to make the same mistakes again. So open your eyes and pay attention and look around and see what the world really has to show us. Look at our history, our true history. Listen to the stories of people that were there, of their experience, and pay attention. And pick up the fiction book if you want a good read. On that note, though, I will tell you to, I'd like to thank Rich Zai from Third Ear Audio Productions for the sound. I'd like to thank Fast Susie for the intro and outro music. And I'd like to thank you for listening. And whenever you're listening, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, whenever it is. And I'll catch you next time, guys. Bye.